So as you can tell, this is a subject that I am very passionate about. And that's because I didn't just decide on a whim in 2011 that I was going to become a writer. I've wanted to be a writer my entire life. I grew up in a situation in which I was lucky enough to be surrounded by books. My mother and my father were avid readers. We had a library of sort of 3,000 books at home. And I'm not just talking about, you know, the big fancy books you'd expect to find in a library, but my father had hundreds of paperback science fiction novels. My mother had her romance books and her women's saga books and her adventure books, and yeah, books were such an intrinsic part of growing up to me, and I loved reading them, and I was just inspired to tell stories myself. The other thing that really inspired me was the fact that my mother was a writer. Okay, I grew up and my memories of her were sitting at a desk clinking away at a big IBM typewriter. She wrote a number of books that were traditionally published. So writing has always been something deeply, deeply intrinsic to who I am. When I was 9 years old, I sat down at my mother's typewriter and I decided I was going to be a writer and that I was going to live in America. But let's just focus on the writing part of things. I was inspired by all of these science fiction books, these adventure books and things. As I got older, I started reading the Saint books by Leslie Charteris, the James Bond books by Ian Fleming, or my father's science fiction books by like Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, all the adventure stories by Wilbur Smith and Dick Francis. It was such a big part of who I was. When I was 12 years old, my parents actually bought me an electric typewriter to start writing my own stories. Yeah, they actually bought me a typewriter. That's how old I am. And in some ways, the die was cast. I was doomed from that point on. As soon as my parents bought me a typewriter, I was destined to become a writer, and that was a destiny I finally achieved. But destiny does take a while to achieve, because, yeah, after that, I suffered from the same thing so many writers experience. I was surrounded by people who didn't get it, who were like, oh, you want to be a writer? That's cute. Oh, you want to be a writer? Well, you know, that's not really realistic ambition. That's not really something achievable. So for 35 years, I would write stories avidly, but I would literally write them on my typewriter and take the pieces of paper afterwards and hide them under my mattress. I would send them off to publishers, and I ended up with practically a mattress-sized stack of rejection slips. I wrote story after story after story. This book, Adventure 8, you know, that was the first novel-sized story based off dozens of short stories that I'd written before about this character, Adventure 8. It was years and years before I ever actually got something published, and I still have the first check I ever received for $25 from, don't judge me, Hustler Fantasies. I wrote a short erotic story for Hustler Fantasies, but you know what? Larry Flint, the guy behind Hustler, sent me a check. He'd signed himself for $25, and I was like, my writing's good enough that people are going to pay me for it. And from that day on, I just continued trying to do whatever it was to be a writer. I was the head writer for a startup luxury men's magazine called Jacques. I used to write articles for Renaissance magazine about Renaissance fairs. I did everything I could to become a writer, and just nothing ever seemed to work in terms of going through the traditional model. But then Amazon appeared and the Kindle was created and people started self-publishing, and in 2013 I decided I was going to do a Thanos, and I said, fine, I'll do it myself. And so in 2013 I signed up for a Kindle self-publishing account, and all of these erotic short stories that I've written for years afterwards, the ones I used to keep under my mattress, I published through Kindle. And do you know the amazing thing? I made my first sale within 24 hours. I'd spent 35 years desperately trying to get a publishing contract, desperately trying to get something I'd written published, and within 24 hours of putting it up on Amazon, I started making money. My first month I made $300, which might not sound like much, but believe me, at that point I was like, I just made $300 from my stories. And every month after that I would write and publish more and more, and I would make more and more. At my peak, I was making $5,000 a month self-publishing just short stories on Amazon. It was amazing. It validated my entire life. And then, of course, Amazon changed the algorithm. Amazon has a habit of doing that, which I'll talk about a little later. But they changed the algorithm in terms of how stories are ranked and the visibility they appear. And that $5,000 that I used to make every month from writing these little erotic short stories just plummeted. And what did I do then? Well, any sensible person might have given up, but not me. As I said, the only thing that I've got going for me compared to much more talented authors is the fact that I'm a stubborn son of a bitch. So 2015 I think was when Amazon changed the algorithms the first time, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna write novels instead, because writing short stories wasn't lucrative anymore, it wasn't rewarding, and to be honest, it's kind of hard work to keep churning out stuff like that. So I decided I'm going to write a full-length novel. I'm going to live my dream and become a novelist. And I settled on the idea of writing romance novels. And yeah, romance novels are probably one of the most lucrative genres of writing to go into, but this wasn't like a money grab. I wasn't being cynical. As I said, I grew up in a house surrounded by books. And as much as I loved my father's science fiction novels, as much as I loved adventure stories by like Leslie Charteris and Ian Fleming and Wilbur Smith, I also loved my mother's chick lit, my mother's romance books. In fact, some of the best writing I'd ever experienced was that particular kind of a book. Jilly Cooper, who wrote like Riders and Rivals and things, fantastic writer. Fiona Walker, who wrote these chick lit books, she was a fantastic writer. I loved the way they told stories, so I decided I was going to write full-length stories like that. One of the reasons I settled on romance was the fact that I tried writing adventure stories like Adventure Ready, and it didn't gel with me. I loved reading them, but when I started to write them, it kind of felt flat. They were kind of like old-fashioned. So I picked on what I thought would be a successful genre. I decided to write romance novels that were based around MMA fighters, and I decided to do what Jilly Cooper and Fiona Walker did so great and have like this universe. So you have one book about one couple, another book about another couple, but that first couple might appear in them. And the first book I wrote in this fictional universe that I created was Flop. It flopped completely. I spent weeks writing this novel and it went barely got anywhere. And why was that? Well, I'll go into that, but I still could not get over this dream of being a writer. And so 2015 was when I first purchased Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course. And back then it was $500. I think it's like $800 then. And that was a significant amount of money for me, because I told you back in my best days I used to be making $5,000 a month, but that dropped off the cliff. I barely was making anything in that particular point in time. So it was a significant investment to buy a course like that. And I did learn a lot from it. And when you buy a course like Mark Dawson's Ad for Authors, you get lifetime access to all that material. So it is good value for money. And I believe all of the information that I gathered there gave me a significant advantage later on down the line. But I say later on down the line because it was not a magic bullet. I bought Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course in 2015 and studied it and did it. I published 5 more full-length novels. And I still never ever got anywhere close to where I wanted to be, despite every single book that I wrote getting better and better. It was, to me, buying Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors course was like being given the keys to a Ferrari but not knowing how to drive a stick shift. But as I said, you stick with it. That's the key to being successful in self-publishing, is you have to stick with it. As I said, I wrote 5 more books, 5 more MMA romance books after that first one. And the reason I did that is because I enjoyed it. I enjoyed writing these stories. I enjoyed creating these characters. I enjoyed having characters from one book pop up in another book. I really started to delve into romance as a genre, and I did one of the other things that I think was key to my success, which was read avidly. I would devour contemporary romance books, and every contemporary romance book that I read allowed me to dissect the books that I'd written and figure out what I did right and what I did wrong. Like that first book that I mentioned that was a complete flop. The reason was I was writing in a very 80s style with third person, and these days contemporary romance is written in first person perspective, and they have alternating POVs. So you have one chapter written from the heroine's point of view, one chapter written from the hero's point of view. My first book, because it was very inspired by Jilly Cooper and Jackie Collins and all of that bed-hopping 80s stuff. People don't like cheating in romance books, so I had to ditch that. And I really had to focus on having a happy ending at the end of all of these books. And what happened was I wrote 5 books, and none of them really, found their ground, but each one was better than the one beforehand. And each one did better, sold more, got more reviews, got better reviews. And so my final MMA romance book that I wrote, I look back at it now and I read it and I'm like, it is a legitimately good, solid book. Still didn't make the impact that I wanted to do, but it was a really, really good book. So I was continuing on this dream, and all the time that I was following along on this dream, I was also keeping down a day job, because at this point I wasn't making enough money to support my family in self-publishing, so I did a day-to-day 9-to-5 job. It was, I live in America, so it's more like 8 till 7. But one day something happened that changed everything. I got laid off. In the summer of 2017, after I'd been writing these MMA books for 2 years, I got laid off from my boring corporate day job, and I had a decision to make. Was I going to go and try and find another day job and just continue this as like a dream, a little side hobby and stuff like that, or was I going to take the plunge and go all in? And after these few minutes that we've spent together, you probably gathered at this point I'm the kind of person who goes all in. So I had a few months of savings packed away. I had learned so much at this point, and I made such progress with those MMA romance books that I figured I was going to do what I had dreamed of since I was 9 years old, and I was going to become a full-time writer. But to do that, I needed to step up my game. And that is exactly what I did.